So a while ago I did a video on the non-genocide of Native Americans, or what I will now call Siberian Americans. And some people thought, oh, he's just being edgy or whatever. Let me justify that term. When we call people European Americans or white Americans, they refer to the location of their ethnogenesis. The fact that they've been living in some other piece of land, no matter how long, doesn't mean they have become something new. And the Siberian Americans, their ethnogenesis was in Central Asia, Mongolia, and Siberia. And they spread around the Arctic Circle, and then down into the Americas. And yes, there is some regional variation in appearance. And the Siberians in Siberia speak a different language than the people who were in what is today the United States before Columbus. But it's also true within European populations and Arab populations. For example, Russian and Englishmen speak different languages, and they have a little bit of a different look to them. You could say someone looks Eastern European. The Arab language is actually varied to the point where someone in Morocco would have difficulty speaking to someone from Syria. And I have heard from linguists that Moroccan and Syrian are more different from each other than Norwegian and Swedish, that a Norwegian and a Swede would have an easier time understanding each other while speaking nominally different languages than a Moroccan would understand a Syrian despite speaking nominally the same language. And while yes, you can say the Siberians in North America are different from the Eskimos in northern Russia, I don't see this difference as meaningful enough to classify them as separate races, just as I don't classify Turks and Icelandic peoples as separate races. In fact, you could argue where to draw the line between European Caucasians, Equatorial Caucasians, and South Asian Caucasians, or the people of India, but those discussions aren't very meaningful. I don't think. Human variation is in a few continuous bands of genetic variation, and also with a few hard breaks. Human genetic variation is continuous in some places and hard breaks in others. Both are true. There's a Caucasian spectrum, then there's a hard break at the Egypt-Sudan border, roughly, between Caucasians and Black Africans. Then within the Black Africans, there's a whole spectrum within that. Now, let's not play around with the term genocide. I know the white genocide people like to do this, but they're shooting themselves in the foot by bringing up the UN definition of genocide. Genocide means lining people over pits and shooting them, or something like that. If it's not that, then it's not genocide. And I could end the video right here. Was the US government doing that? No. Okay, it wasn't genocide in the sense that most people think. It is a dishonest attempt to invoke an emotion based on something that wasn't a genocide in what people commonly think of as a genocide. But obviously, you can see I'm not going to just end there. This is a whole long video. Now, in order to have a genocide, you need to know the numbers. You can't just go with some guy said the white man came here and killed everyone, including me or whatever. I mean, who knows, right? You got all these people saying that they were genocided. Okay, you can't be... People say things. People say they saw Bigfoot and were abducted by UFOs. And this is why historians who rely on personal accounts and journals as the starting point or foundation of their work, they need to be sent to lithium mines or something. Narrative history should be a criminal offense. I'm dead serious, because they get people ginned up and make them into political activists about things that they have no good evidence on. Just hearsay, essentially. A bunch of journals saying something. A bunch of personal accounts. Primary sources, quote unquote. And when you're accusing people of doing horrible things, there needs to be something a bit more rigorous than that. So let's start with the most solid numbers, which is the number of Indians, quote unquote, in the first U.S. census of what we now know are the Siberian American population in the U.S. What was done in 1853 was that census, and there were 400,764 of them. Okay, 1853, there are 400,764 of them in the U.S. How many were there back in 1492? Well, obviously they didn't have a census back then. Unlike now, Rome had a census, and all sorts of civilized societies had censuses, but they did not have a census. So we need estimates for the population. I looked up a bunch of estimates for hunter-gatherer population densities around the world. Now, obviously, assumption, these are hunter-gatherers, and I'll argue for that later. But for now, if you don't think they're hunter-gatherers, if you think that the Siberian Americans in North America were much more advanced or something like that, just go along with the gag for now. And these estimates that I've cobbled together are found in a table here. The first 7 are from Managing Animals in New Guinea, Preying the Game in the Highlands by Paul Silito. The number for Stone Age Britain comes from Late Stone Age Hunter-Gatherers of the British Isles by Christopher Smith. And the last 8 examples come from In the Society of Nature, A Native Archaeology of Amazonia by Philip de Scola. Amazonia is in northern Brazil. So then I averaged these densities, and I'm not taking this as conclusive of anything. Calm down, Light Switch Brain. I'm not rushing to conclusions just on like one little thing here. Let's just map 0.387 to the area of North America and see what we get. Now, if you map this to the lower 48 states of the US, you get 3.806 million. Now, how appropriate is it to map the population densities of Amazonia and Malaysia and the Philippines and New Guinea to North America? I don't know. I personally think it's a very generous thing to do, a very generous assumption. Okay, let's do something else. Let's look at estimates for the global human population in 6000 BC and before. And this will include some amount of early agriculture, since it's not all hunter-gatherers back then. But in fairness, when the Europeans arrived in North America, there was some farming in North America, though it's generally overstated. So we have a low of 1 million at 10,000 BC and 10 million at 8,000 BC as the high. And the average of all these estimates is 5.286 million. And that's for the whole world at these years. So the world landmass minus Antarctica is 134.74 million square kilometers. This is a population density of 0.039 people per square kilometer. Now, with this estimate, I think it's more appropriate to apply it to the whole of North America, not just the lower 48, because the whole world includes places like the Arctic Circle. And North America is a large enough chunk of the world that it seems like global averages might begin to apply somewhat. It's about 14.375% of the planet. Canada is 9.985 million square kilometers. The US plus Alaska is 9.384 million square kilometers. And the combined area is 19.369 million square kilometers, or 14.375% of the world's planet area. And by this method, by just multiplying that by 0.039, we get 772,941 people. Pretty low. That's a lot lower than the other estimate it seems too low to me. Okay, let's go with a high estimate that we had here, with 10 million hunter-gatherers worldwide. That would give us a global population density of 0.04 people per square kilometer. And applied to the US and Canada, that then would give us 1,433,306 people. A little bit lowish, I think, but now it's starting to sound a little bit more reasonable. What about other researchers on this topic? Well, going to Wikipedia, they say the low estimate is 2.1 million, a middle estimate is 7 million, and a high estimate is 18 million. Now, 7 or 18 million, okay, you're not talking about hunter-gatherers there. You're talking about agriculture. You have to be. So with those high estimates, the majority of people here are farming. But I also found some other estimates. One from Milner and Chaplin. He put it at 1.595 million for the eastern United States, as in east of the Mississippi, and Ubelaker at 1.894 million for the entirety of the lower 48. I find it interesting looking at the high counters. They have big spreads between their estimates, well, 7 and 18 million. While the lower counters, they're not only are they closer together in their estimates, but they're also closer to what you get by just mapping global human population estimates pre-civilization onto North America. Moreover, the 7 million number comes from Russell Thornton's book entitled, quote, American Indian Holocaust and Survival, a Population History Since 1492. And the 18 million number comes from Henry Dobbin's book entitled Their Number Become Thinned. Now, I know this isn't a rigorous standard, but if you read the papers by Ubelaker and Milner and Chapin, first off, they're papers, so you can actually read them and they get to the point. And they're very sterile. They're talking about their methods. Like, most of the text is about their methods and why they chose these methods for estimation. And while I haven't read the books from the high counters, at least from the cover and the title, they seem to be about agendas and people's history and trauma and all that kind of stuff. At least that's my impression. Obviously, when someone writes something and just puts it in a book, they've kind of forfeited their entry into the public space on that. If you want the public to know about it, write an article or publish a paper or do something that gets to the point and people don't have to pay for. If you're hiding something away in a book that people have to go past a paywall to get, then you're not part of the public discussion. Now, more recently, I found a paper entitled Hunter-Gatherer Populations Inform Modern Ecology, and they think that the world can support around 10 million hunter-gatherers. Incidentally, the same as the high population estimate that we saw on Wikipedia. Okay, so we already applied that 10 million number to the estimate of the population of North America just by multiplying that by the land area. Okay, but there's an interesting little graphic here in the paper using indicators per 100 kilometers squared. Now, indicators are not people. There's something else. They're indicators of people. And we can see that, according to them, based on these indicators, the eastern U.S. was one of the best areas for hunter-gatherers. Now, there's 10 million people here on this planet, let's say. How many are in modern-day Canada and the U.S.? I can't tell you. I'm just looking at this little picture here. It looks like less than South America, plus there's the rest of the world. Looks like 2.5 million to me from this. But that's obviously not a very rigorous way to do this. But just looking at this, eyeballing it, it looks like 2.5 million to me, assuming there's 10 million worldwide. Here's another set of estimates. I found a book by Robert Kelly entitled The Lifeways of Hunter-Gatherers, and I was able to get access to it for free. And there's a table showing a ton of population density estimates of Siberian Americans in North America, along with hunter-gatherers all over the world. Now, this is people per 100 kilometers squared. So in order to have 2 million people in North America, we need to be seeing around 10 people per 100 kilometers square. And you hit this number quite frequently in certain places. In fact, there's one people called the Chumash in California, which has a low estimate of 843 per 100 kilometers squared, which is 8.43 people per kilometer squared. The population density of Wyoming per kilometer squared is 2.3. So the Chumash, they're not hunter-gatherers. They're agriculturalists, if not some kind of early civilization. But that's as packed as it gets. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Just adding up these groups in California, which is the most densely populated part of the U.S., according to Kelly, that gives us a population density of 1.55 people per kilometer squared, significantly less dense than Wyoming, which is the least densely populated state in the U.S., aside from Alaska. But there's another problem, and this is something Milner and Chapin went over, which is that these may all be overestimates due to a systemic error made by everyone who does estimates, which is that they assume settlements were continuously inhabited, when in reality hunter-gatherers have roots in caches. They move over among multiple settlements. And so what Milner and Chapin did is they came up with their own estimates for the ranges of known populations, and so they created these buffers. And they used this to estimate the population of the United States and Canada east of the Mississippi River. And the estimate they came to was 1.595 million east of the Mississippi. Now, they didn't do this for west of the Mississippi, but let's say the population west of the Mississippi is half of the population east of the Mississippi. Then we get a population estimate of North America of around 2.4 million. So these are the numbers we're kind of hitting at, right? When you avoid sort of the, I think, clearly politically motivated books that are pumping up a high number so that they can then say the lower number later is a result of mass extermination or something. I don't know exactly what their thrust is. When you get away from that and you get to more modern research and you get to more quantitative research, they all shoot anywhere between, the The low ends of 1.4 million, high ends 2.5 million or something. So the next question, were they hunter-gatherers? Because all these low estimates seem to assume hunter-gatherers. And basically, when looking at modern quantitative population estimates of these people, they all assume hunter-gatherer, hunter-gatherer, hunter-gatherer. To the extent that some people in North America were not hunter-gatherers, that some were agriculturalists, then the estimates get more complicated and they can be a lot higher. Because hunter-gatherers have been around for tens of thousands of years, we can make population estimates based on area and estimates of carrying capacity. And so you get narrower ranges when you're dealing with hunter-gatherers because there's only so many people the land can support, and the habits of hunter-gatherers are something kind of well-worn. But once farming is introduced, carrying capacity becomes a variable, it becomes fungible. But I have to come down somewhere. I have to come down somewhere on an estimate for the population of North America. And by North America, I don't include Mexico. I mean the modern-day United States and Canada. So what was the pre-Columbian population of the United States, Canada, and Alaska? 2.4 million. Okay, that's my final estimate. So final for this video, at least. So it's 2.4 million. Now, there are several lines of evidence that the North American, Siberian Americans were mostly hunter-gatherers. The first is a lack of the accoutrements of civilization. They lacked writing, for example, and their fielded armies were tiny compared to those of the Mesoamericans or Inca. And with tiny armies, that indicates low population. And it doesn't necessarily mean a low population, but it's an indicator of low population. And they don't have many great structures. Again, no one thing is decisive in this, but it's all of a piece. There were some Mississippi mounds people like to point to, but mounds like that exist in pre-agricultural populations. Off the top of my head, I know they exist in the Volga region, and they were built before agriculture. They were built by hunter-gatherers, so that's not proof of agriculture. Stonehenge was also built by hunter-gatherers, so certain kinds of structures are not necessarily proof of civilization. Of agriculture. All right, agriculture means settlements where people lived in that showed signs of farming, but just not have civilization. But lacking civilization is a sign that you weren't agriculturalist, as civilization tends to follow agriculture. Now, it's possible that Europeans caught them just as they were starting to farm, but hadn't made the transition to civilization. That's possible, right? These kinds of coincidences do happen after all. But that's unlikely. First off, it's not impossible, but it's unlikely. A second line of evidence, which is the US government had programs that tried to basically re-educate Siberian Americans to try to force them to farm. And this is a very telling point, whatever your opinions about this are, because if these people had populations significantly larger than 2.4 million, they had to be farming. There's no way around that. And for these people, it was like pulling teeth to get them to farm, which is a sign that they weren't farming before the white man arrived. But it also highlights the canard that there was some kind of race-based genocide. Because if they were true racial supremacists in the way most people think about it, not just, we're better for now, but true, like, inherent racial supremacists in the most vulgar way, they wouldn't be trying to bring Siberian Americans into the European American fold like this. Yes, they were trying to destroy their way of life, and they were overt about that. And they succeeded. But this is not genocide. It is a lesser crime if you believe in self-determination, which I do, but those kinds of philosophical discussions are beyond the scope of this. Now, pinch tests. There are a few pinch tests that imply the Siberian Americans had a low population density, and that is by contrasting them with larger populations making first contact with the Europeans. The first and most obvious example is when the Spanish arrived in Mexico and then in the Andean civilization of the Inca. They described these civilizations as they were and had large recorded field battles with armies numbering in the tens of thousands. This is what happens when civilizations try to conquer other civilizations, right? When Alexander is marching through the Persian Empire, going all the way to India, they're describing all sorts of buildings. They're describing lots and lots of stuff. They're not saying, oh, it's empty wilderness. And when the Spanish are going through all these places, they're facing large armies with large unit tactics multiple times in a sustained campaign through a kind of hell march that is an empire being conquered. There are sieges of cities, right? Cities. There are generals on the other side communicating with each other through writing, or in the case of the Inca, through the quechua, which is kind of a rope, written language through knots on ropes. Now, whenever Europeans arrived at civilizations, as far as we know, they didn't hide the fact. They documented it extensively. In fact, one of the great criticisms of the European empires was that they would steal artifacts from other civilizations and put them on display back in Europe. And whatever you think about that, you can say, oh, that's horrible. They're stealing the cultural heritage of other people. Okay, fair point. But certainly that's not Europeans denying the existence of foreign civilizations. Quite the opposite, in fact. But apparently there was some grand 300-year conspiracy to deny such civilizations, but only in North America, not in... here's another pinch test. In South Africa in 1820, they had a population density of around 1.27 people per square kilometer. Again, significantly less than the modern population density of Wyoming. But this was too many people for Europeans to be able to just walk in and settle the area. That was too packed. The Boers in the Great Trek, they came the closest to being able to do this, but they were a minority in the area they settled. They had to fight all the time, and arguably still do. But other than that, it wasn't even attempted. It was only attempted once, and when it was attempted, it was a huge deal. It was arduous. It was painful. It was not like the march out on the prairies with the homesteads and the occasional Indian raids. Okay, the Great Trek was a much more arduous thing than that. Most whites in South Africa, they stuck around the Cape area. The rest of the country was too densely populated. It was too densely populated at 1.27 people per square kilometer. Now, if North America had, say, 7 million people, the lower 48 would have had about 6.36 million people based on the 10-to-1 ratio, population ratio of the US and Canada, which seems to hold based on the number of archaeological sites. So if there were 7 million people in North America, that would be 1.26 people per square kilometer in the lower 48, which is 4.989 million kilometers squares, which is roughly the same density as South Africa in 1820. But South Africa in 1820 was too densely packed for simple homestead settlement. So again, it's all of a piece. This is just another indicator that North America was not as population dense as South Africa, that it was significantly less densely populated than South Africa in 1820. And we know that South Africa in 1820 had a population density of around 1.27 people per square kilometer. So the population density of North America, again, probably had a lot less than that. Okay, so I think a reasonable person would take the plurality of evidence on this and recognize that the population of Siberian Americans in North America is anywhere between 1 and 3 million. Now, why Wikipedia the article seems to be out of date. It's not taking into account modern evidence. There's all this political talk on the site, and I think that's basically your answer as to why estimates are so wildly high. Now, one thing I want to speak on when talking about the sort of morality of this and kind of the morality play. When someone accuses people of genocide, of genociding another people, that's an accusation, and it's not unreasonable to argue for the rights of the accused. That if you're going to make these kinds of accusations, you need to have really good evidence. And I don't mean some people telling stories or giving anecdotes or giving tales. Okay, we're not talking about eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony is a joke. Okay, you need some other kind of evidence, some sort of metric. Now, everyone is a conqueror. Every civilization displaced someone else. The entire planet was inhabited by hunter-gatherers at one point. So, for agriculture-based civilizations to expand, by definition, they had to expand into territory being used by hunter-gatherers, either absorbing them or exterminating them. Now you could say, this shouldn't be the case, this can't be justified, whatever. The fact is, every state that exists on the planet today did something with the hunter-gatherers that were there in the area first, that they currently occupy. Now, we're at a point where we can analyze these things. We no longer need to do it since farming is so efficient. There's no need to. For example, there's no need to expand against the Amazonian hunter-gatherers who are still there today. We don't need the farmland. Now, and this may be outdated information, but I think, at least in around 2010, the whole world population could fit in a densely populated suburb about the size of Texas. I think it's a little bigger now, but the thing is there's plenty of space. Farming is so efficient that there's not the need for this anymore. But in the past, there were farmers who would be born into a family that couldn't produce enough food to feed them. What did they do? It's easy to pass judgment from the luxury of modern food security. But when your choice is expand or die of hunger, well, I'll just say this. Those who held to whatever principles they had against naked conquest, they weren't long for this world. The world was inherited by those who did. You exist because some agriculturalist took over the home range of a hunter-gatherer. Whether it was 10 years ago or 10,000 years ago, you exist because of the kind of naked conquest of the hunter-gatherers that you curse Americans for. Genocide. So, 2.4 million. We're settling on that number. Okay, what was the population of Indians according to the U.S. Census in 1853 again? 400,764. So, wow. 16.7% of the initial population, or an 83.3% reduction. Well, golly, that sounds like a genocide to me, but hold on a minute. The population decline occurred over 350 years. Per year, off of the starting value, this is a 0.238% decline per year. 0.238% population decline. The population of Bulgaria right now is currently declining at about 0.7% per year. Which is to say, Bulgaria's population is currently declining, around 2.5 times as fast as the Siberian American population, a little more than that, faster than the Siberian American population did. And that was a so-called genocide. There are lots of populations around the world today that are declining faster than the supposedly genocided Siberian Americans did. That they're currently declining at a faster rate than a population that we are to believe was being genocided. Moreover, the Siberian American population decline is largely down to admixture, it seems. So I looked at the Native American admixture within populations in the U.S., and on average, non-Hispanic whites have 0.18% Native American admixture, meaning that today there's the genetic equivalent of 356,167 full Siberian American people sort of within the white population. Spread out among the white people are the genomes of 356,000 Siberian Americans. And today there are around 2.9 million people claiming to be Native American, though how genetically they actually are is kind of questionable. In addition, it's also not known how many Siberian Americans intermarried, had mixed offspring, then those mixed offspring went back to identifying as Native American in order to benefit from, modern institutional racism, or what we call affirmative action. Now, there's a pattern here similar with that of psychology, which is that it's bifurcated. There's the low counters of Amerindian populations, and they're doing a lot of math. There's the high counters, and they're using phrases like justice and denial. It would be a straw man to say the high counters don't do any math, but it's like, for the low counters, the math is everything. It's really science to them. A fuzzy and imprecise science, but a science nonetheless. For the high counters, there's math sandwiched between narrative. It's clear who's the researcher and who's the activist. The high estimates are all over the place. The low estimates are more clustered, as if they are centering around some true objective value, whereas the high estimates, they're just fantasy, and so they can be 7 million or 18 million or 10 million. Or I think Ward Churchill goes higher than that even. And just reading the Wikipedia article, nowhere do they even address the problems of these people having high populations if they did so. If there were, say, 7 million, one of the low sort of numbers in the high counter realm, where were the farms? Where was the writing? Where was the civilization? To say that Europeans hid this, well, why didn't they hide it anywhere else? Why are they only hiding it in places that seem to have had only hunter-gatherers? Here's a better picture of what happened. There are around 2.4 million people in North America before Columbus. North America meaning the area of modern-day U.S., Canada, and Alaska, not including Mexico, in North America. And there was some population decline as a result of the white man's arrival. But similar declines are occurring in places like Bulgaria, based on the age pyramid of Japan. Japan is going to fall off a cliff pretty soon here too. And the decline of the Siberian American population was less than what we're seeing today. So there was a decline, but in the grand scheme of things, it was trivial. Now, a trivial effect over a long period of time can have a big effect, but it's certainly not the kind of genocide that these hysterical people make it out to be. There were times in ancient Greece where, by account, writers would say the population is below replacement and there are more old than young people. Whatever you feel about that, this isn't genocide. You want to talk about instances of actual genocide? Tasmania, probably where it actually happened. There may be more, but always be skeptical of this. You should especially be skeptical when the group that was supposedly genocided has millions of people saying that they were genocided. It doesn't mean that they weren't, but it's a sign that one should be a little bit of a skeptical Sam when there are millions of people of a group that claim to have been genocided and they're still here. You also have to think about incentives on this. As a Siberian American, do you gain more power by claiming horrible things were done to you, or saying the true thing, which is that you probably got it pretty good compared to what happened to most hunter-gatherer populations in world history? Do you get more political power counting your blessings or your curses? Curses, obviously. Because then you can try to guilt white people into giving you stuff, or at least have the smug satisfaction that you was oppressed and that's why you're poor, and it's the white man's fault. The reservations are the way they are. From a psychological standpoint, that's far more satisfying than a much more boring and conventional explanation, which is just, this is how you are and always were. That's a pill to swallow. And as an aside, the amount of political autonomy these reservations have is something I could only dream of. I am just as opposed to the current government of the United States as these people are, probably more. Where's my reservation? Where's my semi-autonomous region? I don't get one because I'm white, and that's literally true. And when they leave the reservations, well, then they get all sorts of affirmative action when applying to schools and businesses. There's all sorts of, Native American set-asides for them. Now, sure, you're still worse off as a people financially in spite of these advantages. Nobody is denying the outcome differences. But a difference in outcome doesn't mean you don't have advantages going in. I'm not saying that your outcomes aren't worse. They are. I'm just saying that you started ahead. Obviously, yeah, in terms of like a race, yeah, you lost the race. We agree on that, but you started ahead. The reality of the Siberian Americans is much more dreary and less romantic. It's a bunch of hunter-gatherers who got displaced by an agricultural civilization, one that was so much more advanced than even the Mesoamericans and Inca, who were significantly more advanced than the northern Siberian Americans. They were so much more advanced than the Mesoamericans and the Inca that they got to North America first, that they were able to build ships that could cross the Atlantic and supply all that and account for all that, and then able to conquer the Inca, not Mesoamerica, it wasn't really conquered, but were able to conquer the Inca from across the Atlantic. And that these differences in outcomes persist today, despite the institutional advantages of being a Siberian American. Well, which is easier, blaming outward or looking inward? Okay? And it's quite clear which is easier to do. Oh, don't listen to this guy. He's an evil racist. Okay, well, who's going to tell you this if this were true? Who but somebody who gets called an evil racist would tell you this if it were true? Here's another thing. Somebody merely telling you this, some guy, by the act of telling you this, is going to be called an evil racist, right? So it's circular reasoning. Oh, the only people who tell you that, you're not all cracked up that you thought to be, and you're not actually oppressed, and in the grand scheme of things, you actually got off pretty easily. Who's going to tell you this but somebody who's going to be called an evil racist? Because when they tell you that, they then become an evil racist, right? So if it were true, the only people who would tell you this are people who would then be called evil racists. Imagine if people like me had a reservation and then have what is in effect a localized casino monopoly, a monopoly on gambling, like one of the old medieval charters of monopoly privileges. That effectively is what you have. So you get free money, literally free money, to be able to then legally prohibit certain people from becoming residents of your area based on their genetics. I mean, I find it hard to feel sorry for people with so many institutional advantages that were just handed to them for losing when I have none. I have no representation, I have no institutional set-asides, but then I'm treated as if I'm in power or as if I inherited anything, and then crimes laid at my feet based on what? Based on hearsay. People saying, Ryan, get some credentials. Okay, Rushton had credentials. Emil Kierkegaard has credentials. Well, lots of people have credentials. It doesn't matter. If you get credentials and say what they don't want you to say, then you're a crank. Credentials only matter if you're saying what someone agrees with. And I try to be polite about it. I try to stick to the facts, but it's hard when they won't even listen and you have all these hacks tell them what they want to believe. Why are there people running around saying that there were, 10 plus million people in North America before Columbus? Because there's a market for it. People will buy it. Right? And universities are fundamentally a business. They have to turn a profit. Okay, universities are a business. People will buy this, and there you go. That's why it's being produced. This research is being produced because there's a market for it. Saying 10 plus million Amerindians, well, where's the farming? Oh, don't think about that, but whatever. There's 10 plus millions of them, which means there was a genocide. And it's a battle with people just to be allowed to think and speak, to be allowed to just do your own analysis. Like, can we investigate things? Are we allowed to investigate things, or do we just have to go with the the preachings of the mandarins? Like, are we even allowed to hey, let's pop out a spreadsheet and let's look at what estimate, let's do stuff, let's think, let's investigate, let's explore. Like, it's almost as if when talking to people with reverence for conventionality, it's like you're just not allowed to do that. Like, you're not. I know it's kind of cliche, but it's literally like you're not allowed to think, because if you start thinking and start analyzing stuff, then all the stories, which I guess they imagined is like the glue of their civilization, begins to break down or something. I don't know what's going through their head, if anything, or if it's just sort of a knee-jerk, revulsion to, hey, let's look at some realistic estimates of what the population could have been, And this is something liberating about sports betting. And I've talked about sports betting quite a bit from time to time. In sports betting, it's about getting it right. You just have to get it right. And you don't have to explain to retards why you use this or that statistical method. You don't have to get past some idiot peer review panel or any of that crap. You just have to be right. And if you're right, you win money. If you're wrong, you're one of the losers. And what you'll notice is that in sports betting and in stock trading, amateurs get in and win all the time. And being a professional in those things has nothing to do with a credential. I'm sure maybe there's some college classes on picking stocks, but as a field, it's not dominated by academia. Academia dominates that which doesn't have an objective outcome and cannot be denied. Okay? In sports betting, there is an objective outcome that cannot be denied. And nerdy autodidacts can win at it because all they have to do is solve the actual problem. and be right. They don't have to convince some massive retards why they're right and why a former NFL quarterback is completely retarded at predicting game outcomes and is worse at predicting game outcomes than a nerd with a spreadsheet. They just do it, and it gets proven every week. Take an MMO game. What I like to bring up is World of Tanks, but you can apply it to whatever time waster you played. I haven't played World of Tanks for 2 years now. But when I did, I was a purple player, the top 1%. Not something to be proud of, okay? But imagine if, instead of just doing the thing and winning, with all of the complexities of execution, it's several times more complicated to explain what you're doing than to just do it. And you have to explain it to these light switch brains who are going to argue with you. They're going to have their own opinions. Imagine if I had to explain all of what I was doing in World of Tanks without being able to just say, look, this works. Look how much I win. Look how much you win. Okay, I'm purple, you're green, you're a pancake. Do what I say. Right? Imagine if you had to try to convince them, to not rush Valley in a light, for example, and try to explain why, it would be a nightmare. And they would get mad at you and think you're, imperialist, and think you're an asshole for trying to shove your opinions down their throat. And then imagine that the game dev came in, right? And the game dev is saying, this is how you should play the game. And he gave his ice cold takes on what strategies you should use. And the game devs of World of Tanks, they're not very good. And then the light switch brains will go, oh, well, he's the developer. I'm going to trust him over you. You're just some random guy. But because there are actual objective outcomes in the game, I can easily just say, no, I'm way better than the game dev at this. But it's more difficult to do that when talking about psychometrics, to say, no, look, you should listen to me on stuff about psychometrics because I know more about psychometrics than this guy who has a PhD in psychology. That's tougher. Why? Because there's no outcome. It's not like sports betting. In sports betting, you can say, yes, I know more about this than a former NFL quarterback or this 20-year head coach of the Buffalo Bills. I know more about this than him, right? And you can say that because you can point to the outcome. Same with an MMO game. You could say, no, I know more than the game dev, and I know more about this game than frickin' Kotaku or whatever, because look at my results. Right? There's an objective result there. And when you have these objective results, all the things that you use for politics to try to get to the right answer, they're irrelevant. Okay? Same with the stock market. If you have a guy who's making money in the stock market consistently over time, not just a one-off, if you have a guy consistently making money in the stock market over time, he could say, no, listen to me. Look at my outcomes. My outcomes are better than that of Schuster and Scheckelberg investing, mutual consortium, whatever. Look at my outcomes. My outcomes are better. I'm a better investor. If you don't follow me, you're going to lose money. So when you get into realms where there are objective standards, sort of the trappings of authority aren't as relevant. Those things only have sway in areas where there is not an objective standard. So, and what is politics in the US? Well, it's unicums. This is a term for the top players. Well, politics it's unicums trying to explain to the cran eaters what's going on, and to also prove that the developers aren't actually that good at their own game. Okay? That's what politics is, and that's why this is so hard.